Welcome to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth, and we're here to preserve and promote culture in this benighted age, one weekly conversation at a time. You can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show through iTunes or by plugging our RSS feed into your favorite podcatcher. You can find the RSS feed on our websites, vmspod.com or chimeraobscura.com/VM. We're also on Twitter and Instagram at VMSPod, at virtualmemoriespodcast.tumblr.com, and on Spotify, YouTube, and TuneIn.com by searching for Virtual Memories Show. And visit patreon.com/VMSPod or paypal.me/VMSPod to make a one-time or recurring donation and help me continue to produce smart conversation about books, art, comics, and culture every week at the Virtual Memories Show. Well, I meant to get this episode up a little earlier in the week, but things have been crazy. The work stuff that I mentioned last episode turned out to require a lot more big thinking and diplomacy than I was expecting, and on top of that, my car pretty much gave up the ghost after 10 years and 160,000 miles, so I had that to deal with too. Sorry. I ended up getting the exact same model because I am the most boring person in the world. And weirdly, just about the same price that I paid a decade ago. But as it turns out, there's been a lot of developments in driving technology since 2010. So this one beeps at me and gets mad when I look out the window at the foliage and all that stuff. Anyway, you get 2 episodes this week. So there. Next week, I'll be in Frankfurt on business, but you will get a show then, too. I've got an episode ready to go with Steve Heller, so I won't leave you guys in the lurch. Now, this time around, my guest is the cartoonist Kevin Huizenga. He's got a brand new graphic novel out from Drawn and Quarterly called Glen Ganges in The River at Night. It collects a series Kevin did called Ganges after his sort of stand-in character, who can't get to sleep one night after drinking too much coffee and spends the night in reverie just thinking about things. So this might be a target audience of one, but it's a really good book and captures, well, it captures Glenn's drifts over the course of the night through reveries about the nature of memory, the experience of time, our understanding of the world, and how we read and overread and misread the people we're closest to. In some respects, it's of a piece with the work of a few of my other recent guests. And every fall, there are a couple of cartooning conventions. That's why there are so many cartoonist guests back to back to back. But it's a sort of reminiscent of Chris Ware and Frank Santoro and their recent books, Rusty Brown and Pittsburgh. But each of them approaches these sorts of issues in different ways, and that's both visually and thematically. In Kevin's case, as far as the storytelling mode, he can use a sort of looping, recursive style that also dips into a Pynchon-esque encyclopedic mode. That said, unlike Pynchon, he manages to keep the characters human as opposed to stand-ins or symbols for one concept or another. But he's also got this sort of clean line style that's done in this, well, as he calls it, sausage-nosed characters. So it's different in that respect from the almost transparent style of a Chris Ware or the heavily constructed mode that Frank uses in Pittsburgh. The River at Night, it really delves into our overloaded psyches and how we try to process a world that has us on a treadmill constantly. And Kevin's cartooning, even while it's reflecting that sort of chaos and that way our minds refract on each other, is still really clean and descriptive. He also plays with formal issues of comics as comics, but not for kicks and not to the point of distraction or illegibility or anything. The River at Night is a heck of an achievement, especially following on some of Kevin's past books like Curses and The Wild Kingdom, which are both available from Drawn and Quarterly. On top of all that, it has a page where Glenn Ganges is trying to decide on what book to read in his library, and Death shows up to tell him to think about just how many of these books he'll actually get to before he dies. So in that respect, again, right up my alley, and it's also the starting point for our conversation this time around. Now, as caveats go, we recorded this in the morning during Cartoon Crossroads Columbus, or CXC, and we both have late-night voice. It was Saturday morning of the show, and Friday night was the opening reception, and then this after-party at a bar that also has an arcade in it, so everybody was shouting the night before, so we're all kind of shot. Now, here's Kevin's bio from The River at Night. There's a more extensive version on his website, kevinhuizenga.com, which I'll spell out for you at the end of the episode. Kevin Huizenga splits his time between Chicago and Minneapolis. He has lived near the Mississippi River for almost 20 years, but only swam in it once. His favorite river is the Wabash. I hope I pronounced that right. His character, Glenn Ganges, is based on his brother-in-law, and the name is a reference to two separate towns that appear on the same sign on the interstate. His new book is Glenn Ganges in The River at Night, from Drawn and Quarterly. And now, the Virtual Memories conversation with Kevin Huizenga. With The River at Night, there's a page that I've thought about and used on the internet for years. The panels where Death is talking to Glenn about culling his library. Mm-hmm. So I thought maybe starting with that point in terms of understanding time and what we have left, and sort of how you approach that. Yeah. In the work and in what you choose to read.
I mean, in the book and in the comic, it's just kind of an obvious joke. Yeah. I don't know that it just occurred to me, and then it just was an obvious sequence to draw. I don't know that I actually
subscribe.
I subscribe, but I don't. I think what it is I don't do. Death says, do the math.
Yeah.
And I don't do the math.
Yeah.
In general, I don't do the math. I should do the math. I actually started Jerusalem, the Alan Moore.
Yeah,
book.
I thought about starting that, but
and that's when I actually timed myself a few pages in, and then I calculated that it would take me 72 hours to read, which didn't seem that much. But then I was like, an hour a day.
Yeah,
it'll take me 72 days.
10 weeks of my life.
Probably not going to read it every day. It actually, once I did the math, it didn't seem that bad, but
putting in that level of work for something that,
Yeah, I actually think I'm going to read it.
Eddie Campbell said it was great for the parts he understood.
But I don't do that for every book, for sure. I saw online that there's some blogging where some people are like annotating it and pointing out all the little
I'm sure,
references and stuff, and that was helpful for me. I don't know that I'm going to read it on that deep of a level, but
that was a question I used to have about From Hell, the book, the Jack the Ripper book with Eddie, that it had all those appendices and notes, and that in a sense, if you didn't read those, you might not exactly get what's going on, and how useful is the work by itself if you need all these prose notes afterwards.
Yeah, I remember when I was in college, I worked landscaping in the summers, and I read Gravity's Rainbow. I'd wanted to read Gravity's Rainbow for years, and I got the Gravity's Rainbow companion.
Yeah, that's Stephen
So
Weisberger.
I would be on my breaks from mowing lawns. I would sit with Gravity's Rainbow, and I'd sit with the Gravity's Rainbow companion, and I would look up all the little notes about this refers to that. This refers. And I do like that level of. My voice is frying a little bit from the first night at
I was gonna say being at a show,
being a bar and shouting at people at the bar. I'm trying to talk quiet so that it's not quite so frying. But I didn't. I like that kind of level of writing with all the references and stuff, but I don't really do it too much myself. But I also, with River at Night, I remember making a conscious decision that I did not want notes. There's a fair amount that I feel like I should footnote and put citations, but I did not want to put notes in the back. And so I'm making little zines that will have all the extras and the notes and stuff.
So no Infinite Jest vibe for you either, where
that was actually like that was like an aesthetic choice.
Yeah,
for
I was going to say where it becomes its own story.
Yeah, that was crazy.
Yeah, I still regret that. Luckily, I've at least paid it forward and talked other people out of reading it. So that's.
And then there's also the typesetting of a document like that, where I like to do all the typesetting as much as I can, and then once you get into like dealing with all these extra font sizes, extra columns. Yeah, it gets complicated.
So how does it feel to have the book done? And to maybe finish Glenn? I don't know if it is your...
No, it's not finished at all. Yeah. Glenn... I've always designed Glenn to be like my main actor.
Yeah.
And I use Glenn in different kinds of stories, science fiction stories. There's a branch of the tree now that's like sort of Glenn, but he has a curly mustache and he smokes a cigarette, and then he's like a cartoonist and an artist. And then there's the stories where Glenn is sort of a grandfather, and he's in this Arctic lost world, with the dinosaurs and so on and so forth. So I think of this Glenn as sort of suburban Glenn, and this is only just one story of suburban Glenn. There'll be more suburban Glenn stories.
As a
for sure
suburban guy who wakes up in the middle of the night sometimes, I'm looking forward to it. So
yeah, I don't know. I mean, I even might stay. I've thought to myself, just keeping that like the setup where Glenn, the story starts with Glenn in bed, not able to sleep, and then I can go here, I can go there, I can go this direction, I can go that direction. I could just make that one of my things.
Yeah, thing or a thing for...
One of the things. Yeah. I mean, there'll also be Glenn stories maybe where he's, on a trip or, something like that. But then I could also make those stories if it makes sense. If it makes sense in the story to have like, it's sort of like Glenn in bed thinking about this stuff becomes sort of like a narration frame consciousness. That would be kind of cool. And then I can go back and forth. But I don't know. I have a split in my writing life where there's part of my brain that plans everything out, and then I know well enough to know that I shouldn't listen to that too much, and that I should actually be much more open to improvising and open to where the story goes. So hopefully it's a balance of the two things.
How much of that gets dictated in the drawing process, or how much of that evolves or develops during the drawing process as opposed to writing?
In most of the comics I've drawn, it's been pretty straightforward where I write it and then I draw it, and not much, there's not much changes. In this book, when I got to chapter 5, what's basically chapter 5, there's a lot of chapter 5 that changed, and that was the first time that happened for me, and it was terrible to have to like draw full pages and then edit them and go back. And
how did that change? What was wrong, I guess?
A mixture of things. One thing was that some of the research I did, I read more research that kind of contradicted it, and so then I had to decide to like incorporate the new research to, and then part of it also was aesthetic stuff where I was like, I reread it and I was like, I don't like that. Normally I don't do that much, where once it's on paper and it's like baked in Photoshop and everything, I don't go back. So hopefully going forward I won't fuss with it that much once it's done.
And you don't have any Jason Lutz moments where you go back and realize somebody had an extra arm that you drawn in by accident? Or apparently with Berlin, when he had to go back for the collections, it was, I misdrew that pretty badly.
I'm trying to think. I don't think I had anything too crazy. And if anything, from the beginning, I've done things with Glenn where in one story he'll have one color hair, one story he'll have different color. Like I've mixed in inconsistencies on purpose. And like in this story, Glenn and his wife Wendy have tattoos in one story, and then another story they don't have tattoos. And I thought that was fine, but then I think in the book I took the tattoos off, so that it's more consistent, because it was a little bit weird, I think.
You don't want to imply there's some strange timeline thing. Focusing on essentially, a night where one guy can't sleep, but drawing out the writing and drawing of that over years. How did it change for Glenn and Wendy? How did you change over the course of this? Do you look back at things and, wow, that did not go where I thought it would, or I don't know what I was doing back then, or, I had such a clearer idea back then?
I don't know. I don't think about that much. And when you asked that question, I kind of was like, well, I'd have to think about that for the first time.
Sorry to make you.
No, it's fine. Introspection and self-knowledge is a mixed bag. It's often bad news when you think about it too much, and I think it's like I could look back and I could tell the story in ways where I'm like, I was a better artist then, and I'm worse now. Or I
That's
could tell
also a question I'll ask later on. What did you get better at or worse at? But.
Right, and or I could tell a story like, I don't know. I think it's just things shifted and changed, and I don't know. There's not any big revelations.
But keeping it consistent as your own life change. Partly, the episode going up next week is with Chris Ware, and the first part of Rusty Brown was 15, 16 years of work. Yeah. And the guy who started Rusty Brown is very different than the guy who finished part one. And you could see his storytelling has changed, and his degree of empathy towards other human beings seems to have changed. Yeah. Not that I'm accusing you of having any empathy, but
no, none at all. I'm thinner now. I'm better looking.
It gets better.
I'm smarter.
What'd you get better at as a cartoonist from this process, or even when you go back and look even further? What did you have?
I think there was a point. There was a point in around chapter 5 where I got better at drawing, and I don't even really know how to explain that. And I think if anyone's listening to this who is a cartoonist or artist, if they've gone through this like shift where it's like I suddenly understood how to draw, like I suddenly knew how to draw space better, and that's hard to explain. It's like I kind of knew how to draw three-dimensionally better. Like what I was drawing had roundness to it that it didn't have before, and it's something that just clicked. And not that I'm like super great at drawing now, but it was a definite feeling of leveling up that I didn't force or study. It just like I remember there was a moment where I was like, oh, I think I'm better at drawing now. So that was one thing, drawing a three-dimensional space, but then also being able to understand the space of the page, like the positive, negative space of just design. Like when I started working on pages, I could sort of, as I was putting things on the page, I could sense it's like I could sense the page. It's like Neo in the Matrix or something. Like I could sense the page in a fuller way than I remember ever having before, where I was like, if I put this here, if I put this here. It used to be more intuitive and a little bit more like naively, I would just kind of
things together,
clumsy. And there was a point at which I could just sense more of how to design a page, but that didn't mean that it was easier. That meant that was harder. It's more difficult because you're more sensitive to positive, negative space, and sensitive to like 2-dimension, 3-dimensional things, which again, it's like I don't really talk about that much, so it's hard to talk about. But it's the kind of thing that I can feel or I can sense when I'm drawing more than I used to be able to.
Is there you used to be athletic, you used to play baseball when you were, high school, etc.
Yeah.
I asked because it reminds me of moments when I'd be playing basketball where you understood the whole flow. Like you had those moments where it just fit. You knew where that pass was going to go and how you were going to drop. And obviously with, art making, it's a more deliberate process, but does it match anything in terms of what you remember from,
it's like a difference between maybe tunnel vision and then having like a wide vision where you see in your peripheral vision perfectly, or you even kind of can sense what's happening all the way around you on the floor or something like that. Or, I used to pitch baseball, and I felt like I had an intuitive sense for what the batter was thinking.
I'm going
to
get him with this, and then I'm going to...
Like, I always felt like I was one step ahead of what the batter was thinking, and he was expecting this, so I would do this, or that kind of thing. So it's a little bit like that, for sure. It's hard to put into words.
No, and that's what I'm saying. And there are moments where I just knew... just going to throw the ball back here because I know exactly who the guy is who's running the break with me, and he's going to finish this. And you don't even have to think as it's happening. But.
Yeah, and lately I've been thinking a lot in terms of left hemisphere, right hemisphere stuff, which there's a lot to say about. I went to Linda Berry's workshop recently, and years ago, reading Linda Berry's stuff got me interested, and she's a big proponent of this. This book by, I think, Ian McGilchrist called The Master and His Emissary, which is this big book that talks all about left hemisphere, right hemisphere stuff, and then traces it through history. And I've always been kind of suspicious or skeptical of that kind of level of like...
schematizing.
Schematizing. And I think even people who talk in left hemisphere, right hemisphere stuff will say like, this is just a... oversimplification, but I reread that book thinking about going to that workshop, and that got me thinking in those terms again a lot. And I think like what we're talking about right now is what they would talk about, like the right hemisphere is now sort of a little bit more active and taking control, and the left hemisphere kind of quiets down the chattering and the tunnel vision and the particularizing the world around, and there's a little bit more of a holistic sensing and reacting. And I'm really trying to, like paradoxically or whatever, trying to be more like that is the wrong thing.
Be intuitive,
and then and it's similar to falling asleep. My book, it's one of those paradoxical things where it's like the harder you try to fall asleep, it's like that's not what it is. It's not trying to do it.
Is there any ritualistic aspects or routines and such for either how you write, how you draw, how you make art?
Oh, I thought you were going to ask about falling asleep.
No, I've got a whole bunch of biofeedback techniques for that. None of them worked last night, but other than that,
yeah. Sometimes you just it just is what it is.
Yeah.
Rituals, routines for writing and drawing.
Yeah.
Yes, and I've thought so much about this over the years and tried so many different things. Things work, things don't work. It's a really ridiculous situation because it is. At the end of the day, you need to just sit and do it, and you don't.
Even that's a ritual in some respects, especially if it's a schedule sort of thing. But go on.
But right. But the part of my brain wants to elaborate a system and a ritual and all that kind of stuff, and it gets ridiculous where the thinking about the system or thinking about the thing just gets in the way of just cutting through, getting straight to it. The things that have worked for me have been, I did a lot of this book working at a university library, and that worked great. I would go to the university library. I had access to all the books. I had a big study carrel, and I had plenty of room. I had all this natural light, but I also got away from my computer. At the time, I think I didn't even have a phone. I had a iPod Touch, so I could emergency,
make a Wi-Fi
email.
call, email. You know.
But that's a huge part of it, is getting away from the computer. I think a lot of younger people and stuff, or other people have less of a problem with like going back and forth between computer screen to work, computer screen, and they've like integrated it. But for me, I got to get away from it. And it's hard because I work in my apartment now, and you know, there's so much time gets wasted, and just mental time too, like the time, the context shifting from the internet back to what I was doing to what. And so another thing that I developed over the years, and I haven't been good about for the last little while, but I used to really make a point of saying 4 hours. Like for 4 hours, I have to not be on the internet for 4 hours, at least 4 hours.
Yeah.
And that would be sort of my concentration time. And it would always take like 45 minutes or so to get settled.
Yeah, I was going to say detox almost
into the zone. And I learned over time too that that's what it took. Yeah, it like takes 15 minutes or so to like settle down the first level, and then 45 minutes or so to settle down the next level. And I remember finding that out because I would just force myself to sit and work. And then at a certain point I would shift, and then I would think like, oh, I feel like a shift happened. And then I would look at the clock. And then over time I'd be like, wow, that shift always happens around 15 minutes. And that second shift always happens around 45 minutes. The other thing I do off and on over the years, but it's really, you got to do it, is I just sit down and read. And it's like reading a good book, and it's usually nonfiction, like gets my mind into some sort of linear, concentrated path. And then there's always a point at which, if what I'm reading is exciting to me, then that part of my brain wakes up that wants to make my own work. Mm-hmm. You know, sort of like does that brain look at adapting in any way what you're reading? I mean, I know you have the kind of not weird, you have the sort of histories of science and development within the comics, but I just wonder whether that brain is for sure. Like if I'm reading something and it's interesting to me, like I'd love to make a comic about it. I think about that all the time. But just making time for reading is something that gets you out of yourself, or gets you into art making mind. Yeah. Reading and taking notes, and you write in books, or are these university library books so you can't write in them? No, I used to write in books. I used to write the page numbers at the beginning of the book that had little things that I wanted to. I'd like make my own index sort of at the beginning of the book. And then I took notes in notebooks for a long time. And nowadays, I'm really converted to this system of taking notes, but notes on note cards, and notes on note cards as you read, and then each of those note cards has a number on it. So that note card always has a permanent number address. And then those note cards start to pile up. And then also while you're reading, if you have an idea unrelated to the book, but related to your own ideas, that also becomes a note card. And then just over time, these notes start to accumulate. And if you sit sometimes and look at those note cards, you can start to almost put them in order where they almost start to become an essay or something. And then, or as you're reading them, your note cards, and you look at them, you start seeing where the junctures should be. And so you can even like make new note cards that are the connecting threads. Yeah. It's a system that this German sociologist made up years and years ago, and he was amazingly productive. Part of the idea of it is that your interests in your brain are just working all the time, and the note cards almost become an externalized version of all the little ideas and nodes in your brain. And then you can sit down and actually physically connect them, or like this leads to this, leads to this. Also, yeah. And things aren't a sequence. You can start, and they branch off in different directions. And the idea of putting like addresses. It's almost like an address on the. It's similar to the original idea of the internet that I think Tim Berners-Lee had.
Hypertext, HyperCard, I think was the program.
Okay.
On the old Apples. Yeah, where it was exactly that. They were visually they were index cards.
But also the idea that originally was that everything on the internet would have a permanent address.
Oh yeah,
and the links to it would accumulate over time, but you could always trace it back to the original place, and so you'd always see everything in its context. Mm. Anyways, the idea too is that if you put your notes in a notebook and you put the notebook on the shelf,
it's linear and it's
lost. It's lost and it's not really that useful. But also the note cards, you handle the note cards and you look at the same note cards over and over and over, and so then those start to even like burrow into your brain deeper.
As physical objects too, right?
As physical
sensory aspect of having a physical object is better than I saw it on a screen. And
yes, I mean the alternative would be to take your notebooks out and just sit and reread your notebooks all the time.
You know how depressing that is. Sorry.
Right. The other thing that I've been doing too is like I've been taking notebooks for years too, and so now the idea is to actually take these notebooks and turn them into note cards so that they'll be in circulation. Yeah.
Yeah. I think Nabokov also used to write fiction doing note cards, and it was all just, he'd type on card after card after card, and then,
I mean, it's not a new thing. Like when I was taught in high school, we were taught how to write research papers using note cards, and I think I just forgot about it. And I was like, and I think a lot of people are like, well, that's the dumb system that they teach you in high school. I don't know if everybody gets that system in high school, but looking back, I was like, yeah, my English teacher taught me the correct system.
Do your former teachers know anything about your artistic world? Have you sent a book back to your old school or anything like that?
Not yet. I think some of them know through Facebook, Yeah. No, some of them get it. My German teacher in high school, like I was doing these kind of comics back then already. Yeah. She was also my journalism sponsor and I was the editor of the high school newspaper, and so I was like doing comics but also doing the newspaper, and I should send her a book.
Now, you started out as I did, superhero geek.
Yeah.
What was the transition to, and we'll just use the term art comics instead of indie or all the other terms we have for it. Do you remember getting out of Marvel and DC like the first time, or?
Yeah, I do. I mean, I have a couple moments in high school that I think about all the time. Yeah. There was King Cat, of course, John Porcellino's King Cat.
But to jump from like...
There was a comic book store in Calumet City in Illinois named Amazing Fantasy, and they had a spinner rack of mini comics. Mm-hmm. And so on this spinner rack, there was King Cat and John Porcellino, but then there was also a lot of Bay Area. I think for some reason they got stuff from Puppy Toss. It was an old zine mini comic distributor. So they had a bunch of Bay Area stuff. So that was a transition, was the early Optic Nerve mini comics and the King Cats. Then there was also Acme Novelty. I remember this moment when I was on a road trip in high school and I couldn't sleep, and I was sitting in the hotel hallway, and the sun was coming up, and I was just like sitting and reading comic books in the hallway. And I remember reading one of the Acme Novelties and just being like, this is the stuff. This is it. I remember reading Linda Barry's comics in high school. Like I have a sense memory of walking to the cafeteria and reading, I think it was something like called It's So Magic. Mm-hmm. One of these books from the early 90s. I think it was It's So Magic, or it's Come Over, or something like that. I remember walking to the cafeteria after reading some of it in high school and just thinking like, this is the best. This is so amazing. So it was things like that. But then there was also Cerebus. Cerebus was a big gateway.
Until a certain time, there was nothing wrong with that.
Right. And that even, I think that all went down when I was in high school even. It
was in like 94, maybe.
The Victor Davis stuff.
The women are sucking away men's life form.
Yeah, and
I was grad school at that point.
Even when I was in high school, I was like, this isn't right. This doesn't seem like my thing. I remember Cerebus, though. Cerebus, before the internet, it was the comic, but then there was this huge letters page and then all this text in the back. And I think I maybe learned about Fantagraphics through the letters columns of Cerebus, stuff like that. So I would read, I'd find out about stuff in the letters column in the back of Cerebus, and then I would seek that out, and then that would lead to another thing and lead to another thing.
Alan Moore turned me on to Thomas Pynchon,
Yeah. Alan Moore.
You have all these threads and connections, but
I think I remember when Big Numbers was coming out.
Yeah. And then when it stopped coming out and no one could explain the story for years.
There was just in high school I was looking for everything, and it was like, I'm old enough to say it was before the internet. Yeah. So you had to just like go to a store and like look at everything at the store,
The thing was in the Comics Journal. They would have that
Comics Journal too, yeah. And
they have reading lists, or this is what I'm reading this summer, and they'd have like 30 different writers, artists, editors.
Yeah.
And same thing. You all of a sudden, and not just comics, it was also prose stuff. You'd find, oh, okay, I guess I need to read this stuff because I like this cartoonist. Yeah.
When I was in high school, I remember I sent away for this book. That was it was an academic book about cyberpunk fiction.
Yeah,
because I had read Neuromancer. I was a science fiction kid growing up. I read all kinds of science fiction, and so that was another branch. And this academic book about cyberpunk fiction had lists of like bands and movies and writers who were like cyberpunk adjacent, and I just like worked through that list, stuff like that. And later in college, and I think about this sometimes with the students that I had, like I didn't read Mouse until college. I didn't read Watchmen until college. So a lot of that stuff came later. I mean, it was out already. I just had never read it. So I read a lot of that stuff for the first time in college. And then for whatever reason, I got a copy of the Smithsonian book of newspaper comics. I remember I got that off eBay, and that changed. I think I probably got that because of somebody, probably Chris Ware, somebody mentioning it in an interview. And the Smithsonian book of newspaper comics then, because around that time I was already drawing comics. I started drawing science fiction comics, and then I really never drew superhero comics except as like a joke. And then after King Cat and that stuff, I started trying to do like light autobio, mundane, everyday type stuff. But I didn't really know what my like style was. And after I looked at the Smithsonian newspaper comic strips, then I kind of was like, I kind of want to draw like these old domestic, what maybe now is sort of referred as the Midwestern school of like all the guys who worked for the Tribune. And I think that's where Glenn's Sausage Nose came from. Yeah. And I don't really even know that I draw like them.
But that was
as much as it's more like that's sort of an ideal, sort of like a vernacular cartooning style. The camera is sort of pulled back. The heads are not too big. Show the character in the panel as much as you can. That was the ideal, and I don't know that I do that like consistently as much as I should. But that was the first moment where I was like, okay, I think now I have a view of a style I could work towards.
How much of that was a conscious working out on your part? I mean, reading those comics, did you see, It
was very conscious, but it wasn't like I was lazy about it. Yeah. So like in my sketchbooks, I would sit and copy stuff out of the old newspaper strips, but it's not like I did it. I was sort of lazy about it. Like I wasn't very diligent about like really, really fully understanding how Frank King drew or Roy Crane drew. Like I would just copy them every once in a while. And then after I'd copy them, I'd be like, oh, now I understand that the leg legs bend backwards a little bit, you know.
Why they drew it the way they drew it?
I don't know why they drew. I mean, I think
is that what you would pick up on, you know, in the act of copying, that it would start to...
You just pick up like little, the way that when you copy superhero stuff, you start to understand like, oh, this muscle and this muscle or something like that. And then it just like enters into your vocabulary. Mm-hmm. Same thing when you copy artists, you kind of like, you're trying to kind of like learn some of their tricks, like how they draw ears or how they draw knees or something like that. And then if it clicks, then it's like, oh, like I can put this in my toolkit now.
Like Fred Hembeck and do the little ampersand knees. I'm sorry, it's an old Marvel reference.
Yeah, they're spirals, right?
Yeah,
they're spirals.
I think they're little ampersand or at symbols. Yeah.
Really? I think they're spirals. Well, we'll have to look it up.
We'll call Fred. He's up in New York State. But
Fred,
you mentioned teaching. When did you feel? When did you feel like you could teach? That you'd learned enough about what you, or do you feel that you can teach, or are you cheating your students? That's
well, I don't know. I mean, who decides? Who decides? I suppose they decide when they give you a grad, they give you a master's degree. Mm-hmm. But that's a whole other thing.
But it's
I didn't decide. I mean, I was in Minneapolis, and they had an opening for a visiting professor, and I talked to them about it, and one thing led to another, and I did that for a while. Mm-hmm. I didn't have a formal education in comics. I kind of barely had a formal education in art. And so mostly what I knew, I figured out myself. And I figured it out enough that I felt like, well, I can pass this on. And there's also sort of a golden rule aspect to it where you think like, I'll tell the kids what I wish somebody had told me. Yeah. That kind of thing.
Do you wish you'd gone to a CCS sort of thing or some sort of comics education when you were coming up?
I don't know. Yeah. I don't have a feeling one way or the other. It would just have been a different timeline.
Yeah. Yeah, I just wonder if I wish somebody had, again, taught me X, Y, and Z when I was...
Yeah, I think it took me a long time to learn things, and it's still taking me time to learn things that I think probably they're learning in their early 20s, and I'm still stumbling on, or something like that. Plus there's the camaraderie of peers, having all these peers who are doing the same thing. That's so valuable to like have all these people who you just know that you're struggling with getting to the desk every day and putting time in and like putting all this work into comics, and just knowing that all these other people are doing the same thing is always helpful to me. And like when you meet them, there's just shared understanding, you shared understanding about like the joys and sorrow and struggles of it that are often mixed, where like the fun of it is how hard it is to do in part.
Do you remember, your peers moment where you really felt like you were kind of accepted into the fraternity? And B, do you remember any freakouts? I know you still don't think, but and do you remember freaking out around anyone whose work you idolized?
There was somebody. I'm trying to think now. Give me a second. You can edit this, I guess. But there was somebody in San Diego who I was like, because I'm not afraid of anyone, to talk to anyone. But there was someone at San Diego, and I'm trying to think of who it was, who I was like, oh, I'm actually afraid to talk to that person. Yeah. But I'm not going to even remember who it is now. I'm still pretty afraid of Gilbert Hernandez. Really? I'm still pretty afraid of Dan Clowes.
Beto actually, he made me his show buddy at SPX a couple of years ago because he didn't know anybody else. And he remembered me from the previous year, so he just kind of latched on to me. We ended up spending like 3 days just shooting the breeze at SPX. And I thought,
you talking Dan or Gilbert?
Gilbert. Yeah. Dan I've met once briefly, and he has turned me down for this, but I don't hold it against him. I could understand how this sort of milieu is just not something he wants to engage in unless there's book publicity that has to be done.
I'm really wishing I could think of who I'm thinking of, but it was somebody
during the weekend.
So there's still some people who who I'm like generally like nervous to talk to.
And have you ever seen anyone with that response to you?
I guess so. Yeah.
Not to be self-aggrandizing, but
No, and it's rough. It's rough. I mean, I would definitely, when I was younger, I had that with people where you you're nervous and you babble, or you're even like, well, my hand's shaking a little bit. This is silly.
There's a question I've asked a few people, but has anyone ever shown up with a Glenn Ganges tattoo or anything that's...
No, I don't think my work really lends itself to tattoo people.
Well, the game designs, the fighter run.
Yeah, fighter run. I had a guy approach me a while ago about doing a game, and it kind of fell through. But it would have been, I think that would be really fun to work on and think about. It'd probably be a lot easier now than it was when we were talking about it.
Is gaming a thing for you, or is it a metaphor within the context of the book?
Last night we were at Brewcadia.
Oh, yeah.
And all the video games were free. Is that normal at those barcades that they're free?
Like you pay when you come in, it's a flat rate, and then you just play all night.
Oh, okay. That makes sense.
Yeah.
I had never really been to one of those, and last night I was like, oh, if these exist in Minneapolis, I'll be there all the time.
There's an arcade. There's a couple of them in New Jersey where it's not a bar thing, but it's just you pay by the hour, and it is shit tons of old games from our childhood.
Yeah.
Not just like, Bassmaster and all that. It's like Sinistar and those things, and it's just...
When I was in high school, me and my friends were legitimate, like, we would leave high school and go to the arcade.
Yeah.
And then we'd go home if there wasn't baseball practice or whatever.
Did you ever think there's a recording angel following how many quarters you were blowing, that when you die, someday they're actually gonna tell you how much money you wasted?
I don't even think about that.
Just me. Okay, good.
So I kind of forgot how much I love an arcade. So I might get back into that. No, with video games, my line now is that I'm video game sober.
Yeah.
Because I think I was pretty addicted to them for a while. And now I'm just like, I think I'm done. Mm-hmm. And I don't let myself buy a TV. I don't let myself buy
then if I just got this Xbox, I would, yeah.
And I don't even have games on my phone, but it's not like I struggle with it or anything. It's just,
it's easier.
I think I have a little bit of an addictive personality where, once it's people. Everybody does it with video games. Yeah.
They're engineered to do that.
They're very addictive. Yeah, just like the internet. And I feel like there was a point even when I was playing a lot of video games, sort of in my 30s still, where I remember just being like, I would play through a whole game and finish it, the campaign or whatever the story, and I'd just be like, I would be like, honestly, that was a waste of time. Like, that took me 20 hours or whatever, and I like diligently played and worked on that game, and I don't feel like I have anything to show for it. Right. Like, it wasn't even that great. Like, it wasn't that aesthetically amazing. A lot of times I think that I like to think about video games more than I like to play them. I like to speculate about, wouldn't it be great if you could have a game like this or like that? I used to dream about video games a lot.
If you play, that tends to happen. But back when I used to play, it would affect your brain. So that,
I had a dream one time about a video game that I still think about all the time, and I'm not going to give it away. But I almost think like it would be a good idea for a game, and I think you could do it. And I've seen some games that do it. But anyways,
did you have a goofy handle? Did you do the online?
I did. I was a balloonist on Xbox. And I played a lot of Team Fortress 2. I played with a particular group of idiots, It was a weird mix of people. It was amazing to me to meet all these people around mostly Americans, but there was an Irish guy. And we would play all the time, and it was fun. It was also like a real waste of time and unhealthy, but it was also addictive and fun. And they were, genuinely funny people. They were also genuinely like sexist and racist people, the way that, everybody knows about these gamers. Not all of them. And then there were, I say there were young women too who played on our team, who we were like all skilled players. And so we would just go in and dominate all these other teams. One time we did play another team that really,
was it that talent level thing?
Yeah, they were another level up, and they really humiliated us. But I did that for a few years, and then at a certain point, I just had to beat. I was like, I'm done. I'm done with this.
Yeah.
I think I tell myself that when VR really comes into its own, you know what I'm talking about, virtual reality. When that really comes into its own, I'll play around with that for a while, and
And we'll see this wizened husk holding a pair of goggles up, and you'll
hopefully I'm not gonna like binge and VR myself to death or anything. I'm just gonna like set aside some time and be like, all right, I'm gonna do this for a while. That's been such a fantasy since high school for me.
Early 90s.
Like my first comic that I drew was a science fiction story all about virtual reality helmets and all that kind of stuff, and because I was all into that cyberpunk stuff in high school.
Same here, dude. Gibson, Sterling, Rucker, all that Whole Earth catalog. You'd start to, again, other pre-internet things that could refer you to more of these guys.
Do you follow him on the Twitter, William Gibson?
Yeah, Great Dismal. Yeah,
Great Dismal. Yeah. Sometimes I think like he's on Twitter all the time.
I know,
and
he's writing his book.
It's disappointing to me, kind of. Mm-hmm. Like a lot of people are disappointing to me on Twitter. Like, don't meet your heroes and don't follow your heroes on social media either.
Yeah.
Like I can't think of very many people who I like them more after social media.
Yeah.
Almost everybody I'm like, oh really? Like, and even just the fact that they're on all the time, I think like, oh, that's how you live your life. Like that's disappointing.
You really
you're
need
just
that
like
feedback of all those likes. Yeah,
you have like 50,000 tweets or whatever. Like, I don't know. I don't think William Gibson's going to listen to this, but
I did pitch him a few years ago when I was headed out to the Northwest. But he was finishing a novel, and
he's still putting out novels, and I'm a few behind. I'd like to catch up.
Same here. I haven't done the Peripheral yet. So I think he's got a new one coming next spring. But that's a fun thing of doing the show is that I end up, that 6 degrees of separation thing, and I just get closer and closer to certain guests who I've been, trying to get for years.
I think I'd be nervous around him. Like I was a big fan at the people I'm nervous around now tend to be people who I was like big fans of in high school.
Yeah.
And might not even be big fans of them anymore, but like that younger part of me is still there.
I'm with you.
Where like,
13-year-old
it comes to the
me
surface and starts messing with my motor skills. Yeah.
When you talked about that sort of, again, intuitive understanding and the page as a unit, essentially.
Yeah.
Like I saw Dash Shaw and Frankie Santoro do a whole presentation on this in terms of, seeing the whole flow of the page.
Yeah.
Again, is that something you overthink in terms of those, or is it the,
I think I overthink everything.
Well, yeah,
for sure. No, I'm not sure. Sorry, I'm not sure what you're asking. Exactly.
Is it something in terms of do you find yourself occasionally, I guess, treating a comic as an engineering issue as opposed to art? Do you worry about getting, again, too schematized?
Yeah, obviously some of the River at Night book is ridiculous, complicated pages, and some of it is pretty straightforward. And I say this all the time that I think I go back and forth where I try to do some storytelling that's really straightforward, and like ideally you want it to go down like butter or whatever. I don't know. It's like it's just effortless reading, and it's effortlessly smooth. But then I feel like when I do that for a little while, then I want to slow it down and make it a little bit more difficult and confusing. Not confusing, but just more advanced,
complex.
Say. Yeah. And then, and part of that is by contrast, then the effortless stuff seems even more effortless. And by contrast with the effortless stuff, the more complex stuff seems you know? So I try to keep it balanced, or I feel like I'm paying it. It's like a economic transaction or something where, like, if I do enough of this, I've earned the right to do some weird stuff. Mm-hmm. But if I do too much weird stuff, I kind of have to compensate by doing some easy, crowd pleasing, simple storytelling for a little while. Or, you know, if I get too serious, I got to go back to joking around a little bit. Mm-hmm. Can't joke around too much, then, you know.
Yeah, how much audience awareness?
Very little. Very little. I don't think about
how are they going to react? Yeah.
No, and I even have a hard time even understanding that I have fans. Like, and I think psychologically I have an issue where maybe when people come toward me, I push them away. So I have that maybe with my fans a little bit. And with my comics, I don't think in terms of like building a fan base or my readership probably as much as I should. I think, if anything, I think about a few of my peers who I want to respect what I'm doing.
Yeah.
And as long as I feel like I have that, then I'm okay. But the average reader, or especially the average comics reader, I don't think about that much, and I don't really have a sense of them or what they're looking for or anything like that. Yeah, I'm really just kind of thinking about a few other cartoonists who I'm like, I don't even want them to think that I'm great, like I'm the greatest. Like, I just want them to think like, yeah, he knows what he's doing.
Yeah.
Like, okay. Yeah.
He's competent.
Yeah, that's enough for me. That's all I really am looking for.
Anyone you want to name in that cohort, or is it just the guys who
it's
are
all
in
the usual people.
Okay.
Yeah, it's all the usual people, and a lot of my friends who
Sammy
I'm not gonna satisfy by naming them.
Is the installment serial aspect of it beneficial? I mean, is it the only?
I think it's a practical thing.
Yeah.
There was an early point, and I try to teach this to younger students, but it's not true of everybody. But for me, I planned out a big thing. I got a few chapters into it, and then I got lost interest, and I also realized that this is going to take too long. And so early on, I decided, like, I have to approach this stuff modularly. That's how I think of it, as a modular thing. I even think about the pages a little bit modularly, as like, it's boring, but I draw a page that's basically 4 rows, and then I could divide that page up into another book where it's two rows.
Yeah,
like that page is divided into quarters, and so on and so forth. Anyway, so I do sort of think the right way to approach comics is a little bit at a time and let it develop organically, rather than to plan it all out as like an architect. People do that, and it works. But I think in general, and I definitely have a personality where I want to plan the whole thing out like an architect, but on a practical level, I don't think that's the right way to go. And I think it's more difficult. I think the right way to go is a few pages at a time, or a few stories at a time. And my brain can't help but sort of think long term and plan out a whole big thing. But it's almost like a hobby. You know, I think like, oh, that's nice that you're doing that. Like, it's nice that you're thinking about how it all fits together, but don't get too attached to it, because it's probably going to go in a different direction, you know.
And I guess that's the question that I meant about, you know, how Glenn and Wendy change over the years this took, and how you change. How did you know what The River at Night was in its entirety, or
No.
how much was it flowing and you know?
No, when I set out at first, it was just going to be a new series, and it was going to be published in multiple languages. There's this whole story about the Ignatz line of comic books that was designed by this Italian publisher, cartoonist named Igor. And his idea was that we were going to publish this line of comic books. They were going to gang press them so that the black ink would be swapped out for all the different languages. So in part of the design of the thing was only to keep all the words in the black ink, but then you could use another ink for shading. And that was it at the beginning. And I was like, I'm going to draw a 32-page comic book. It's going to appear in 6 languages. Great. And so I just wrote a couple stories, and they all kind of fit together. And then they ended with Glenn in bed, full of coffee and unable to sleep. And around that time, I think I remember taking a walk, and I remember thinking I could just keep Glenn in bed as the sort of base camp of the book, and I could go all these different directions from this. And the idea came into my head that I could do this for the rest of my career. Like I could just be the guy who does a comic about the guy who's in bed and he can't sleep, and then we go everywhere for there. And I liked that idea so much that I kind of thought, well, okay, that's what I'll do for a while. And that's what I did with the book. That was the idea. I'll just stay there. The book that Glenn ended up reading in the first issue, the first chapter, that book sort of started to become more and more important. Basin and Range by John McFay. And the concept of time, like the first story I did was called Time Traveling, and it was just about this thing about like when you take a walk in a neighborhood that you've taken a walk many times. Again, left brain, right brain stuff. It's kind of like if your left brain, chatter brain sort of quiets down a little bit, there's sort of a shift that happens where time feels a little bit like, it's like you're not taking the walk today, you're taking a walk over years, the same walk over and over. So I kind of did a story just about that sort of feeling that I had. And then, so then time became not because I was obsessed with time, but almost because once I had it on paper, I was like, well, I can come back to this. I don't know if this is true with other authors, and I don't know if this is people who aren't authors necessarily always understand this, that like, we don't choose our topics ahead of time. Sometimes the topic comes out of the writing, and then once it's there, it's like, well, I'll just keep using this. Mm-hmm. This is a fertile plot of ground to farm or whatever. And time was that for this book. And just in the same way that like laying awake in bed was the same sort of thing. Like once you get a setup in the story that you're like, oh, I can, like your initial interest is in making a lot of good work about whatever. Yeah. Like you don't even care. You're agnostic about the content of it. You just you're interested in the form of it. So anyways, I ended up with Glenn in bed. I decided to stay there. And then, the next story was about video games and about the .com company. But then I just like framed it with Glenn still at night, unable to sleep.
And it all ties back to one guy he bumped into on another remembrance, and framing it in such a way that everything can be encompassed by this is still a guy's consciousness as he's lying in bed. Yeah,
and I mean, to like what I'm talking about using stuff over and over, to a ridiculous extent, I think everything that happens in the book happens twice in some way. Like almost everything that comes up, I would immediately think, oh, I could use this again later in this way. Yeah. So it's like, it's that sort of thing that's like a recycling your own ideas, where it's like something comes up arbitrarily about, like I had Glenn in reverie and then I needed to break the reverie somehow. And I think just arbitrarily, I thought, oh, that weird thing that happens sometimes when someone drives past you and waves and you're like, oh, who was that? That was, and then I just used that to break Glenn's reverie. And then later I thought, well, that guy will be the guy in the company that he works, and it just, it happens organically as you're making it. But then looking back, you think, did they plan this? Did they not plan this? And that's part of the fun of working on these big projects, is looking back over something you did and seeing that there was some sort of like order in it that you didn't know at the time. That's, I think, one of the great rewards of working on something large over time, is not planning it out ahead of time, but letting it unfold organically, and then later looking back and seeing within it the paths that you didn't plan. Yeah.
So what comes next? I know the book's just out now, and
Yeah, I'm gonna make some zines about the book. Some of the extra materials, I'm gonna do that. I'm basically gonna start two things. I'm gonna do a new series called Fielder, which is gonna be serialized the next Suburban Glen storyline, which right now is called Fielder, Michiana. Glenn lives in Fielder, which is, I'm putting in Michiana, which is the region between Indiana and Michigan. Mm-hmm. I grew up in Iliana, which is the region of Illinois. And I could make it Fielder, Iliana, but that's just too on the nose, I think. Yeah. And Michiana has a kind of a prettier... Anyways, so it's called Fielder, Michiana, and it will, again, probably like develop organically, but I kind of have an idea for where it's going to go. That's going to be in the comic book series Fielder. And I think the material that's going to end up in Fielder is going to first end up in a zine series or mini comic series that I'm going to draw for my patrons on Patreon, and that'll just be called F. So F, it will just be a catch-all series of everything, like even my notes in my diary and stuff like that will go into F. And I'll make little zines of that and send those to my patrons. And then that stuff will end up, the actual comic stuff will end up in Fielder. And then, as that goes, once the storylines are put together, Fielder will become the next books.
And anyone you're hoping to see at CXC this weekend?
Anyone I'm hoping to see at
they're cartoonists or other people that... And/or, what are your best practices for festivals and cons? What have you learned about dealing with the... outside of don't shout in a bar arcade on a Friday
Well, what
night.
happens is often you're catching me at a moment where there's this natural process that happens where I lose my voice and then it comes back deeper and more resonant. That's actually my real voice.
Ah, okay.
my pinched everyday voice that is my everyday voice. Like I need to kind of shout that out and get rid of it. And then the deeper kind of like
FM radio guy.
So like tomorrow night or tonight, I'll have the good voice. So we're a little bit early for that, but, best practices, I don't know. I'm to the age now where I kind of am done standing behind a table all day. Mm-hmm. But that's, I think, what I'm going to do today. But instead I'll probably like take a nice long lunch and that kind of stuff. I try to have a good attitude and, I enjoy drawing. So when people come up to get something signed or something, I maybe like take a little bit longer than I need to like draw and like enjoy myself. And that helps me like get a little hit of feeling good. Cool. And also when people have sketchbooks and they want you to draw in the sketchbook, I kind of don't mind that much because I'd rather sit and draw and concentrate on the drawing than just like stare at the people around me at the tables.
Do you take pictures of the things you draw in their sketchbooks for your records or for?
I always forget.
Okay, I have no idea if that's a thing for you guys or not. Whether you
no, it's a good idea. I always forget. More lately, I've kind of remembered to take pictures of when I sign books for people. Sometimes I take pictures of them. I need to get a new phone. The camera on my phone is full of little dust mites.
I used to have one like that where you just get this one shitty weird like, purple thing in the middle,
like
of
gray circle. Yeah. And if you bang the phone on the ground, it'll shake the. But then it's not really good for it too. Yeah, and I don't know. I used to buy. I used to love to come into the show because then I would just buy everything and come home and I'd get to read everything. Lately, I'm a little bit more in a saving money mode, and so I don't think I'm going to buy quite as much stuff.
No. We'll tell people to hit up your Patreon anyway during the introduction. So
yeah, cool. Good.
Kevin, thanks for coming on the show.
Thank you very much.
And that was Kevin Huizenga. His new graphic novel is Glenn Ganges in The River at Night from Drawn and Quarterly. As someone who occasionally goes through middle-of-the-night reveries about the nature of existence, I enjoyed the book a lot, and I've always dug Kevin's explorations of the phenomenology of life and the evolution of our understanding of the natural world and what it says about us. So I recommend The River at Night. You should check out Kevin's site, kevinhuizenga.com, for more on his comics, his mini comics, which accompany this sort of stuff, his extended bio, and plenty more. That is KevinHuizenga, all one word, .com. Now he's on Instagram as 1000 Kevin H. 1000 is 1000, and on Twitter as Kevin H 1000. You can find both of those through his website. And if you want to support his ongoing work, he has a Patreon at patreon.com/Kevin Huizenga, spelled just like the website, and that has some neat patron-only material. And Kevin is the sort of cartoonist that Patreon is built for. His work isn't super prolific. He's not putting out stuff constantly. This is a way to help support him. He will produce mini comics and blog posts and things that kind of let you in as a supporter, but it also helps him keep up the good work. And after we wrapped, I asked Kevin, so, who you been reading? And if you want to hear his answer to that and get some extra conversation, you'll need to become a supporter of the Virtual Memories Show so you can get access to our quarterly bonus podcast, Fear of a Square Planet. I'll get the third quarter 2019 episode up soon, I hope next weekend before I leave for Frankfurt, but no guarantees. Meanwhile, the second quarter episode features an hour of book recommendations and fun conversation with Mark Allen Stamety, David Shields, Michael Carroll, Frederick Tutton, Ursi Soteropoulos, Caitlin Foisey, Seth, Nina Bunjevac, Stephen Guarnacha, Hugh Ryan, Bill Griffith, Boris Fishman, and Barbara Nessim. You can support the Virtual Memories Show via patreon.com/VMSpod or paypal.me/VMSpod. There are all sorts of goals and goodies in place for patrons, including that podcast, a patron-only blog, handwritten show notes for every episode, my secret project, and more. So go to patreon.com/VMSpod and support the art of fine conversation. Now, I recorded this one during Cartoon Crossroads Columbus Weekend, or CXC, in September. Hotel was $560 for 2 nights. Airfare was $550. Parking at Newark was about $100. And so spent a little money on coffee, a couple of meals, lift out to Ray Ray's Hog Pit and back. So about $1,300 for the weekend. I did get in 5 podcasts from Friday afternoon till Sunday when I did this one, as well as some really fun off-mic conversations that will probably lead to future episodes, so it all works out. Still, if you want to help defray some of the costs of the Virtual Memories Show, like web hosting, travel, equipment, and coffee, or just toss me some money because you think the show is worth it, then visit patreon.com/VMSpod or paypal.me/VMSpod and make a one-time or recurring donation. Special thanks go out to Nick Bartosik, Buzz Carter, Michael Hacker, Michael Janizik, Fred Kish, Annie Koyama, Jonathan Kranz, Kevin Katila, Jack Lescamella, Stephen Nadler, Barbara Nessim, Jim Ottaviani, George Fow, Payne Prophet, Dmitry Samarov, David Small, Stephen Solomon, Greg Tanner, Ford Thomas, Armando Veve, and Garrett Zecker for going over and above in their support of the Virtual Memories Show. We have the full list of show supporters at chimeraobscura.com/VM. Our music for this episode is Fella by Hal Mayforth, used with permission from the artist. You should visit my archives to check out my episode with Hal from the summer of 2018 and learn more about his art and painting. And you can listen to his music at soundcloud.com/Mayforth. And that's MAY4TH. And that's it for this week's episode of the Virtual Memories Show. Thanks so much for listening. We'll be back next week with another great conversation. You can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show and download past episodes at the iTunes Store. You can also find all our episodes and get on our email list at either of our websites, vmspod.com or chimeraobscura.com/VM. You can also follow the Virtual Memories Show on Twitter and Instagram at VMSPod, at virtualmemoriespodcast.tumblr.com, and on YouTube, Spotify, and TuneIn.com by searching for Virtual Memories Show. And if you like this podcast, please tell your pals, talk it up on social media, and go to iTunes, look up the Virtual Memories Show, and leave a rating and maybe a review for us. It all goes to helping us build a bigger audience. Now, you've been listening to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth. Keep reading, keep making art, and keep the conversation going.